And Surya, if you wanted to do the honors of introducing our next guest.
Yeah, sure. I'll be introducing two lightning talks at once. So first we have Shan Kulkarni, who's a cloud security engineer at CMD Solutions Australia. He has strong hands-on experience in software and security engineering, as well as building and running systems on Kubernetes and AWS. He's passionate about all things cloud, DevOps, and security. And his talk is on how to start with DevSecOps on Kubernetes. It's a pretty interesting talk.
Amazing.
And
Surya, I think we'll be all right to just have
Yeah.
the one introduction, and I think Randall, you can do the one once Shantanu finishes his talk. Okay. Hey, Shan, how are you?
Hey, Shilpi, good. How are you?
Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to your talk about DevSecOps and Kubernetes as well. I think two topics that everyone's talking about, and I think Kubernetes is hot no matter where you go. So we will put your slides up here, and Surya and I will go to the backstage and let you take it away.
Awesome. Is my screen visible?
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. All right, cool. I'm just gonna get started because I can't see the StreamYard. But yeah, hey everyone. My name's Shan. I'm a cloud security consultant. Do a lot of cloud security and platform engineering these days, although I used to be a software engineer as well. I'm working an AWS consulting partner here in Sydney called CMD. It's part of a broader tech consultancy group called Mantle Group. And I'm also founding a DevSecOps orchestration platform called Nullify on the side. And yeah, I guess like the genesis of this talk was in my experience working with customers, both from startups all the way to enterprises. I really found that like container security is something that especially greenfield customers have difficulty starting with. So maybe they're like experienced building containers, like containerized workloads, or maybe they've just started containerizing their workloads and they're just getting started with building on Kubernetes. Overall, like they're having a bit of difficulty in conceptualizing security and how to secure their Kubernetes environments. So yeah, that's kind of what I aim to give to everyone today, is whether you're like a security engineer, a cloud engineer, or even just like a software engineer, how to start like a level 100, how to start thinking about container security and how to get started right away. Cool. So I guess this is a DevSecOps conference, so I won't spend too much time defining what the essence of shifting left and DevSecOps is. Obviously, we all know that by adding security testing earlier in the SDLC, we can save a lot on both vulnerabilities in production, as well as like productivity and increase productivity and reduce developer friction when adding security testing to your environments. Despite this, like when I go and I work with customers, who are especially ones who are experiencing a lot of scale, like they have, let's say 500 developers for every one security engineer, consistently observing this builders to security ratio disparity, which, as I mentioned, grows as the organization grows as well. So like obviously DevSecOps is great, but there still remains kind of persistent silos, particularly between like CloudOps and SecOps teams, as well as the DevOps and AppSec teams as well. And ultimately, what you get is just like these cultural silos where the developers are doing their own thing, the AppSec teams are not really understanding how the devs are working, and the CloudOps teams who are like working very much like async and a bit out of sync with what their developer teams are building in terms of like cloud infrastructure as well. So yeah, like everyone is kind of struggling to speak the same language. And while this is like a generic problem, I think a really good symptom of this is container security, or at least it becomes evident when you look at how container security is being approached in a lot of modern organizations. So as we all know, developers are now responsible for like securing their own code and infrastructure. Like this is a direct, I suppose, implication of the cloud operating model. Everything is code, everything is an API, and seemingly overnight, developers have had to own a lot more than just the security of their code, like security of anything that they write, infrastructure, configs, can then turn into a threat surface if it's not secure. So kind of given this, if we drill down deeper into like how containers, I suppose, exemplify this change, containers really change the application security model. The way that we build containerized workloads is very different. Like we never patch running containers in place. We always like rebuild and redeploy. And we also like rebuild, retest, and like redeploy as quickly as possible. And they're often like short-lived, ephemeral, sometimes stateless workloads that are spun up and down like very rapidly. So obviously, like there's a bit of a sort of lag in between like how traditional security testing like methodologies and life cycles are like evolving to like cater for new workflows, particularly around how developers are built and deployed at scale. So how containers are built and deployed at scale. And if we kind of double click on this even further, so the same way that containers change the application security model, Kubernetes changes the operational security model. So we've gone from like static workloads and static IP addresses to like fully declarative, dynamic, and automated workloads, which are deployed and spun up and spun down through an API server. Application configs and deployments are managed in like completely different ways. So I might want 3 replicas on one particular deployment, and then to scale up and down, but then I don't know the IP addresses of that instance that has those deployments on that particular node. Containers can get deployed across nodes in your cluster. And overall, this makes reasoning about security in Kubernetes environments a little bit harder, at least from a traditional kind of cybersecurity testing perspective. And so, for example, working with large enterprises particularly, I see things where developer teams and DevOps teams are like having almost no contact with their security teams, maybe like a once a year pen test. And ultimately, they're just like not understanding their security requirements and obligations around building secure containerized workloads. So yeah, they're dynamic. They require full automation to secure. And because of this, because of the way that we reason about these workloads, they're often opaque to like traditional security testing tools and workflows as well. So yeah, can't reason about them from like a traditional cyber perspective, and we need to build in automation like as early as possible in the SDLC in order to secure like systems like Kubernetes, which can get really, really complex at scale to manage. So I don't know if anyone else agrees with me when looking at this, but this looks pretty scary at a first glance. This is a data flow diagram published by the CNCF of a generic Kubernetes cluster deployment. So 1 control plane, 1 deployment, and 3 worker nodes. So no multi-tenancy and nothing kind of particularly complex or difficult. But you can see in even such a simple sample deployment of a Kubernetes environment, there's a lot of trust boundaries, both at the container runtime as well as like the container orchestration layer as well. So like it's not hard to see why in a world where developers already see security as a blocker or as friction, are finding even further difficulty in reasoning about securing their Kubernetes workloads, because like as you can see, it's kind of a bit scary even for security teams to get started with. And so while there are kind of things like CIS benchmarks, I know Microsoft published some nice threat models and kind of attack matrices and things like that on how to understand like what to secure and how. Overall, it still becomes very like difficult. It's still a very high barrier of adoption for the people building and operating these workloads to get started with thinking about how to secure them. So there's some great projects in the space around like with control plane and deciduous around like attack trees and automated and visualized attack trees using like GraphViz to make it very clear like what an example attack path could be for a compromise, like for a Kubernetes exploit. And as I said, like there's threat matrices published by some really prominent like frameworks and benchmarks out there, but overall not very developer friendly, bit opaque to get started with. And obviously as this complexity grows, like you have environments which have multiple clusters, maybe a staging cluster, a production cluster, maybe a organization is doing namespace as a service or even cluster as a service, you can see it getting very out of hand quickly when starting to think about like how to get started with securing your Kubernetes cluster. So I'm proposing a very simple, almost like a level 1 threat model for Kubernetes. This is actually graciously appropriated from Ron Amosa's talk at KawaiiCon, New Zealand, called Kubernetes on Hard Mode. And in that talk, he dives a lot deeper into multi-tenancy specifically. But I really like this approach that the NSA and CISA published on the 3 main threat actors in when it comes to Kubernetes clusters. So the main reasons clusters are attacked are for data theft and data compute theft. So these days, seeing a lot more cryptojacking and, if you're running, let's say on EKS, a lot of EC2s, EC2 instances, mining Bitcoin and things like that, particularly in developer and staging environments where security controls are a little bit more lacking. But as I said, in the model, the NSA identified 3 most likely sources of compromise for Kubernetes clusters, them being the supply chain, so container images, obviously, your actual container runtime, the underlying infrastructure that your Kubernetes pods and deployments and cluster is running on. The threat actors is the second one, so bad actors, someone out there performing remote exploits, usually with stolen credentials, but often sometimes just through like really, really weird things like exposed API resources. So I suppose recently there was quite a high-profile breach with Tesla, and also I believe Google separately, where there was a Kubernetes dashboard just like openly exposed to the internet, which I thought was pretty funny. And you can kind of from that see just how little thought is being put towards securing workloads as they're built. So yeah, threat actors, and this can be not just stolen credentials, as I said, but exposed like data exfiltration through control plane resources. So improperly secured API servers on Kubernetes, which you can then enumerate and exfiltrate data from around the container runtime. And I would actually also put like secrets found in containers through this as well, because that's often how privileges get escalated and exploits actually get crafted as well. So everything like from your containerized apps, everything running in your data plane, this is all fair game, like that's exposed externally. And then the third one, which I think is thought about a little bit less, is insider threat. So, we all know that head of SRE or CloudOps, someone who has full cluster admin, users who are one privilege escalation away from root access to a node. And even also like thinking about service providers. So obviously like cloud service providers publish like shared responsibility models on like what they're responsible for securing, and often anything below the infrastructure of your compute is abstracted away, but you still have to remember like they have access to your cluster and your cluster runtime as well. So like starting with that threat model and then moving a bit further to like mapping that threat model to some controls, still not obvious. I mean, I look at this, which is from the CNCF landscape for cloud native security, and for cloud native, like the cloud native CNCF landscape, and you can see there's a lot of different tools in the space which often overlap, and it's also not clear like right away which types of security testing should I be performing, when should I be performing them, who should be owning them, and who should be managing like these different tools at different stages. So so starting with that threat model that I defined earlier, mapping it to 4 very basic threat surfaces. So starting at the very bottom, the code that you're actually building that gets built into your containers. So this is your application code, as well as your infrastructure code that defines the cluster config, but I'll get to that in a second. But focusing purely on the code of your actual workloads, this is everything that is built into those containers, including dependencies, libraries, open source libraries that you're dependent on, internal packages that you're publishing internally, and any code that you're publishing internally as well. Obviously, then the next layer up, once this gets built into a Docker image or a OCI image, container image, getting built into some sort of artifact or build artifact that gets then run in the container runtime. So obviously, this threat surface is very much focused on like how are you making sure that artifact is as secure as possible. It's not containing hard-coded secrets. And the auditability of the changes to that artifact is very well defined, which I'll also get to in a second. The next one up, obviously, is the cluster. So started with the code. The code gets built into a container. The container will get deployed on your Kubernetes control plane. And this threat surface is mainly around making sure the configuration that defines your Kubernetes cluster is not insecure by design. So you're not doing things like running containers as root, and you're not doing things like having overly permissive service accounts in your Kubernetes cluster as well. And then the last layer up from this is the actual underlying infrastructure that your Kubernetes cluster runs on. So if you're running obviously like serverless Kubernetes, so let's say EKS on Fargate, if you're on AWS, or you're running, let's say like Knative or Fission, you probably don't have to worry about this because you're abstracting this away to the cloud provider's shared responsibility model. But if you are managing like the underlying infrastructure of your Kubernetes nodes, this is an added piece of an added threat surface that you need to be really careful about locking down and making sure in the scenario of an attacker somehow managing to get, like, for example, a container escape, crafting and executing a container escape exploit, making sure that the infrastructure, the host runtime is locked down so they can't actually do anything, even if they manage to escape the container runtime into the host. So yeah, mapping those three threats. So insiders, supply chain, and bad actors to threat surfaces, code, container, cluster, and cloud. And now for each of them, like, this is a great place to start, but how do we actually think about what security activities do I need to perform at each stage? How do I perform them? And what are the main things that I should be worried about or concerned about when I should be performing them? So obviously starting with the first one for code. So most common design pattern for this is an application code monorepo. So you often have maybe microservices which have subdirectories that build into a separate microservice. Not always the case. Sometimes you have a separate repo for each microservice, but generally that's what I've seen in the wild is you have one repository which contains the code that gets built into separate containers, which runs in your Kubernetes cluster. Again, sometimes this can be contained in the same repo with the Kubernetes manifest files that deploy these things into your cluster. But just focusing right now on the application code, I guess the priorities here and the objectives here are to make sure that you're failing as fast and as early in the SDLC as possible. So you're integrating very natively into developer workflows and code review processes, and you're making sure that the universal security gate for merging into master, which is that code review process every time a PR is raised, some sort of static code analysis or SAST is being performed at that particular stage. So there's a lot of tools out there that perform this, obviously Snyk, Nullify, Mend, a lot of combination of open source and proprietary offerings out there that you can use to integrate in the code review process to run SAST. IDE plugins is another great way to do this. Snyk obviously have a great offering in terms of how they integrate natively into developer IDEs. Me personally, I feel like this is a little bit too hard basket for a lot of organizations, especially when they are not standardizing the IDEs that developers use. So maybe some devs are on Vim, some are on VS Code. So oftentimes your safest bet is to make sure you're running some sort of SAST before you're merging into master. SCA is obviously another thing here. You should be making sure that the packages before your container is built are not introducing any new vulnerabilities into that container artifact. So you can kind of see the flow here is every time an PR is committed, whether using Nullify or Snyk, run some sort of static code analysis on the PR, check for common weaknesses and enumerations, and then after it's been reviewed, merge in. So now going to the next one, the container. This is probably the one that people talk the most about when they think about image scanning, or like how do they make sure that the container images are not reaching their registry with any insecure components. So here the most common activity is obviously container image scanning. So after you've run SAST on your application code and after you've built your Docker image, making sure that you're scanning your container image to make sure that there's no vulnerabilities being introduced. Ideally, you would do this before you merge in and publish it to your image registry. But you can also set up scheduled scans on your image registry where every time an image gets pushed, making sure it's being scanned and that scan results are somehow being surfaced back to the developer teams. I won't talk too much more about that because that one's, I suppose, pretty obvious. But one thing I do see customers like not fulfilling best practice with is immutable image tags, which sounds a little bit trivial, but it's very underrated win that you can get around safeguarding yourself for potential upstream supply chain attacks, making sure that every time you build a Docker image, tagging it with the commit hash of the pull request that built that Docker image. This is both great for reliability and, I suppose, fault tolerance if you ever want to roll back to deployments which are stable in case you introduce breaking changes. But more so, it's very important when you want to reason about, let's say, if you're doing incident response, or you want to reason about the auditability of like how secure your Docker images are. Very hard to do that if you're constantly just overriding the latest tag every time you're pushing to your registry. So making sure you have immutable image tags, and then if you're mature enough, going a step further than that even, and actually signing your container images with the hash of the commit as well. And then also dynamic analysis. So this is a bit more novel, but if you're importing, this is particularly if you're importing third-party images, particularly from vendors. So when you perform SCA in the previous step, you can probably scan your Docker files and make sure the base images you're importing are secure. But sometimes you may have malware in third-party images that don't show up as CVEs. So unless you're analyzing those images with for like malware signatures, it can be very hard to find out whether or not third-party images are actually doing suspect things at runtime. So there are a few vendors out there, Aqua particularly and Sysdig, but they're also open sourcing projects around Falco and Tracy, which allow you to run eBPF-based monitoring to actually make sure that the container images that you're either building from in your own images or that vendors or third-party projects are supplying to you don't contain malware that do things like make calls out to paste bins or try to pull in malicious packages at runtime. So as a very low-hanging fruit, scan your images, tag them. But if you're more concerned and if you have a very, very large environment with lots and lots of third-party images, make sure that they're locked down and perform some dynamic threat analysis on them, and make sure that they're not doing anything weird at runtime as well. And then obviously, lucky last, the Kubernetes manifest repo. So right now, up until this point, like we've been focusing on all the code and all the components that get built into your containers. But what about the configuration of the cluster itself? So how do we make sure that we're stopping misconfigured or insecurely configured resources from being deployed into production or staging clusters to begin with? So again, here, the best thing to do is a very low-hanging fruit is to perform static code analysis or SAST on those IAC templates. So plenty of different ways to do this. Chekhov is great. Kublinter, plenty of SAST tools out there that have really, really nice rules for making sure that your Kubernetes manifest files aren't doing insecure things. So things like deploying containers as root and making sure your RBAC is really locked down, making sure that service accounts aren't overly permissive as well. And this is something that I see people overlooking. And then when they then run point-in-time scans, maybe using Kubescape or Kubebench, they find a lot of their resources are out of compliance or insecure. They could have just picked that up, and they spend time remediating it, but they could have just picked it up before even deploying those manifest files into their production cluster. So if you have some sort of GitOps setup, if you're running Argo CD, whether it's push-based or pull-based deployment, same concept as your application code SAST. Whenever you make a PR to change configs in your manifest files in the YAML, make sure some sort of static analyzer is running on them. And then if you're more mature enough to have a staging production, pre-production or staging cluster or namespace where you actually stage changes to run, let's say, integration tests against those workloads, don't hesitate to actually run tools like Kubebench or KubeHunter, which actually run on live Kubernetes deployments against your Kube API server. And they give you benchmarks against things like the CIS Kubernetes benchmark, or they actually find out through breaking means. So obviously don't do this against your production clusters, whether or not you have any exposed vulnerabilities through the Kubernetes API. So I've seen some 10.0 CVE scores of 10.0 from things like Istio or Envoy proxies, things that you can pick up in pre-prod and staging if you're doing some things like cluster scanning and benchmarking using some of those tools. But yeah, that's it. So that was the last threat surface after container. And yeah, I guess, sorry, one more is cloud, which is the underlying workload. So make sure that your underlying infrastructure that the Kubernetes clusters are running on. So here, make sure you're running SAST on all your infrastructure as code. So whether you're running Terraform or CloudFormation, make sure you're not having things like overly permissive security groups, overly permissive IAM policies. Same concept as previously. You usually have a combined repo with your manifest repo, but if you don't, if you have a separate repo, make sure you're running IAC SAST like Chekhov, TFSec, or CFN-NAG, and making sure you're not deploying any infrastructure as code that is insecure by default. But that's it. Obviously, reach out to me. My Twitter handle is in my tag. Obviously, reach out to me on LinkedIn. And if you want to find out more about the stuff we're doing at Nullify and orchestrating DevSecOps, feel free to reach out as well. And yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting. And I think, it's just, again, one of the things with lightning talks, it's so hard to sort of capture everything you want to say in like 15, 20 minutes. So I think you've definitely done a good job. And I particularly liked, how you started off with that really complex diagram and you gave a simple alternative because really I think Kubernetes is very, very complex when you actually go to do it. I think it's marketed sometimes as being a simple solution, but when you actually have to implement it, there is a lot to it. So I think you've given some really great advice over there. We may have to jump on to our next talk. Shantanu, thank you so much for the talk. And, he's shared his details. So if anyone does have any questions, please ping him on his details, and I'm sure he can discuss all things DevSecOps and Kubernetes. We do have our next speaker. So Surya is going to introduce. Thank you so much, Shan.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Shan.